When dealing with hostile parties, you must consider their wants, needs, and even superficial desires. The entire purpose of the...
Bale, are you the same Bale from the stories of Village Doka? My father was telling me about them recently, but he didn't really know the story all that well. I was hoping to get the story straight from the source.
No. No, we don't talk about that. I don't talk about that. Now back to the lesson. Negotiations are always a tense affair, and if you aren't careful... Seeing as how this class has never been more attentive than when that topic came up, perhaps it is time I faced up to this. I need you to picture a tiered village built into abrupt cliffs. The buildings in the village just as straight and sharp as the cliffs they are built onto. Made mostly of sandstone, though thick oak wooden structures around, creating a contrast between the light orange sandstone and the dark wood. That is the village I was raised in, the village of Dokar. This village was run by a people. Well, more like a cult. The Burr-lohns, they had a narrow and delusional sense of what constitutes a person. It was all centered around physical prowess, believing that the inherent strength they were looking for was only given at birth. Any child born in the village who was examined and did not meet their insane standards was dashed against the rocks. Murdered. I certainly don't match the standards they had. My short, squat stature would be of no use in their eyes. The only reason I'm alive is because I was born in a different village. My birth caused the death of my mother. My father, being a good man, never blamed me for it, as was common in that time. But early in my infancy, he needed a way to distract himself from the pain of losing his wife. Tending to me was necessary, but only reminded him of the loss of my mother. He began spending every available moment exercising, pushing himself further and further. At first it was recreational, just trying to distract himself and get better. But his newfound physical strength became a story of its own, one that was passed from village to village. And soon, that story found its way to Dokar. He, now, was exactly the type of man they wanted. A few of their members came to our village directly, trying to bring him in. He told me it didn't take long for him to agree to join them. Because of his newfound focus on physical strength, there was always going to be a divide between us. But by accepting their invitation, he only succeeded in making sure we were never going to be a close family again. Maybe that's what he wanted. But outside of those selfish desires to have him be more like me, I just wish he had seen the cult for what they really were. When he agreed to join them, they examined me. They said the only way he would be allowed to do so was to dash me on the rocks, right then and there, for them to see. I did not meet their criteria for a worthwhile being. He refused. They insisted, but he would not budge. They grumbled, but ultimately decided his service was worth more than my death. I was allowed into the village under a special circumstance. If there were any reasonable people already living in the village, they would have questioned this special circumstance offered only one person, and the illusion would have fallen apart. But the villagers already living there had either not needed to make that decision, or were too far into the cult's teachings to question it. And so I grew up in this village as mistreated would not be the proper term, but an outcast, unwelcome anywhere in the village. There was a distinct sense that everyone just put up with my existence. As a result of this, as soon as I was able to be on my own, I began venturing outside of it. It wasn't long before I met the village's neighbours in the nearby woods where the oak trees used in Dokar had come from. A village of satyrs resided in there. They were friendly with both myself and Dokar. For those who have never seen one, a satyr fully grown is about half the height of an average man. So even today I am only slightly taller than them. I fit in much better with them than I did with my own village. The satyrs are small, but are much more densely built in muscle, being able to lift an entire fallen tree with one hand. They have a human torso and upper half, and a goat's hips and legs. They have pointed ears and small goat horns that grow out of their heads. The origins of their species is perhaps a lesson for another day. Satyrs specialize in metalwork, crafting great weapons and armor, something Dokar was very interested in. That is the sole reason why their relationship was a positive one. There were warrings in the past between the two based on an attempt to dominate each other. Those battles had ended in a stalemate, and those years had long since passed. All of the newer generations had rid themselves of that hatred. The satyrs were several hundred strong, just like Dokar. But among those several hundred, I was able to find 3 who were around my age and took a liking to me. Kin, Kolo, and Haran. Funny names to a human child. But, normal names for them. The years went on like this. I took any chance I could to get away from my village, spending time with my friends and theirs. Unfortunately, there was still a divide there. I was welcome to come and visit, but not to stay. In that manner, their attitude felt even worse than Dokar. I knew where I stood in my home village. It was made evident every moment I spent in it. But the satyr people would make me feel welcome every day, and remind me that I wasn't, truly. I had, in fact, stayed a few nights in their village, urged on and hidden by my friends. During one of those instances, we had reached early adolescence. Because of the satyr growth patterns, that meant my friends were ready, able, and more than willing to drink. It didn't take much pressure from them to get me to start drinking, well before my body was developed for it, and way above what it could tolerate. I don't remember much of that night, just flashes of some kind of fight. But I did not fight back. But I do have a distinct feeling that I was safe. That my friends would protect me. And something that evening proved that protection would happen. No matter what. As I reached later teen years, my human desire to explore and see new things began to grow. I always had the sense of the cult village I lived in being just that, a cult. But that became more and more apparent as I grew older. I spent almost no time in Dokar anymore, spending all of it with my friends, and even less time in their village, and more time scouring the woods. Through my tight friendship and years spent with the Satyrs, I had learned many of their legends, and one day, Kolo suggested heading to a known part of the woods. Not known because it was well mapped or even often visited, but because it was a... I don't quite know the word. It's a unique word to the Satyr language. Something I knew once, but have now forgotten. Consequences. In the human tongue, it means something between holy and cursed. I protested to the idea of visiting the place, knowing the legends surrounding it, but the others outvoted me. Even with all of my time spent with them, they knew more about their culture than I did. If they felt it was an exciting place to go, then I would follow. The main focus of this supernatural place was a rotted tree. The trees surrounding the area were all the normal dark-colored oaks, but the Everdeath tree, as they called it, was pure black, looking ashy, flaky, like one touch could cause it all disappear into dust. In the base of the tree was a hole, large enough for even a human to walk into with ease, but just as the story said, the entrance was in such a position that no light ever reached into its mouth. It was just a gaping hole of darkness. The story said countless satyrs had gone in, but none ever returned. My friends began to bicker among themselves, and I'll admit it was a bit fun watching them, each trying to work up the courage under themselves by saying the others were too afraid. Perhaps because I had protested to the idea in the first place, or some other reason. My boredom and curiosity caused me to leave my friends and begin circling around the tree. I can't say it was a whole thought at the time, just a hunch, or even the beginnings of an idea, but this thing could be not natural, man-made, or satyr-made. My friends didn't notice me when I began to climb. My plan was to climb as high into the tree as I could, sit on its jutting branches and call to them, begging them to try and do the same. It would at least pull them away from their pointless chiding. I made it up a few branches, but then what little strength I had really began to give out. I reached for the branch above, but my fingers slipped from it. I began to fall. I grabbed desperately at the tree. My hands came to a sudden, painful stop on a knot sticking out. It held me as I got my bearings. Then it slowly turned. It made a full rotation, then stopped. I heard a click and a hissing sound from below. My plan broke and I climbed back down. It was only when I was back on solid ground that I really noticed my friends no longer bickering. All of them were leaning into the hold entrance, staring intently. I joined them and saw what they were staring at. It was no longer just a black hole, but a passageway had opened leading downwards. This time there was no need to spur each other on. We all began to descend the steps without question, curving around and around. There were signs of a cave-in that had happened, but the rocks had long since shifted away, and skeletons of satyrs who must have been killed in the cave-in were trapped within. We reached the bottom. What lay before us was a massive treasure hoard in a cave that extended well beyond the limits of the hoard, and if my later guesses are correct, directly towards Dokar. There were random piles of gold, but most notably priceless objects, treasures of great historical value. Some my friends recognized from their own history lessons. Others I recognized as legendary treasures of humans. And Dokar. There was a brief moment where we questioned what to do, but my friends concluded they would not keep the hoard a secret, especially when lost pieces of their history were stored down here. We quickly made our way back to the Satyr village, informing their chief of the hoard. The excitement was flowing out of us. And despite agreeing not to keep the hoard for ourselves, my friends then pushed for a share of it, for finding it, which the chief agreed to. All four of us would be given a share of it once it was all exhumed and studied. Days went by. Time needed to assess the contents, the pieces of historical value to the satyrs. And I had to keep quiet while in Dokar. Most people didn't care that this excitement was pouring out of me. But my father noticed, and he questioned what I was so happy for. I clearly had never shown this level of enthusiasm during all of my days. And I couldn't tell him. Soon, I was summoned to the Satyr Chief's throne room, and he gave me a message to deliver to Dokar's leader, that certain high-value human treasures were found within, and they were going to return them once they figured out how to get all of them out of the chamber. I ran back home, excited to finally be able to speak about all this and to deliver the message. I spoke to my father, finally telling him all that we had found and the message I was to deliver. This message was bigger than me, and I hoped he could instead deliver it for me. There was a gleam of pride in his eyes. He demanded that I be the one to deliver the message, and escorted me to the leader's throne room. The guards there grumbled at my presence and my father's demands, but they obliged him. The leader was in his throne room, but beyond the initial glance that made him aware of my presence, he did not look at me for all the time I was in there. He tried to appear busy, but halfway through telling him what had happened and the message I was to deliver, he ran out of things to do and just stood there, looking away from me. I finished delivering my message, and he seemed uninterested, letting out only a small grunt to show he had heard me. Looking back at those years, I should have gotten it through much sooner. But it was only then that I became acutely aware that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried or what glory I brought to Dokar, I would never be able to justify my existence in his eyes. Still, I kept up my manners, thanked him for his time, and left. As my father turned to leave with me, his leader called for him to stay. A flash of hope was exchanged between us. Even if he was unwilling to speak with me, he had definitely heard my message and it affected him in some way. I left the chamber. Alone. Hours later, my father returned home. It took some work to get it out of him, but he finally began to speak about the meeting that followed. His leader lambasted my father for using his position to allow me, this slug, into his presence. But he found my message worthwhile. The leader's counselors were gathered to discuss what comes next. The first question out of the leader's mouth was if they could win a war against the Satyrs. In retelling the events and my message, I had been careful to only mention that human treasures were found. I said nothing of the hoard of treasure beyond them. So why would he consider this? Even his military commander seemed shocked by the question. After a tense moment of silence when no one wanted to answer, the leader burst out laughing, claiming it was simply to make sure everyone at the table was awake and attentive. Then discussion turned to the treasures themselves, what they could possibly be, lost throughout their history, even extending beyond their history and reaching into lost human treasures. My father was ordered to give me a message for the Satyrs, that they would accept the offering and look forward to it, which I delivered to the chief word for word. I didn't explain the events in Dokar this time. Everything looked to be going well. Days went by, and I noticed the treasures were being brought up from the chamber, but I was never given any of the messages to deliver. Soon, my father began to ask if I had in fact delivered Dokar's message, and when we could expect the first batch to be brought. And I didn't have an answer for him. I confided in him that all of the treasures had been started to be brought up from the chamber, but the chief had not spoken to me since. Telling him that was my first. I gave the Satyrs a few more days, but once all the treasures had been brought up from the chamber, then I began to ask questions, so desperate to please. The chief gave me vague answers, no clear timeline, and he seemed to be having to refocus his attention on my questions several times. But the leader noticed the time passing as well. After Dokar's initial message, I was never contacted again. Soon, messages were being delivered by others to the Satyrs. Clearly, they did not want or trust me to do it. Their messages started weekly, then turned almost daily. They began polite in tone, but became more and more angered by the lack of response. Soon, the Satyrs stopped sending anyone to listen or respond to their messages. The leader took notice of all of this. In an effort to threaten or escalate things, the leader began having military units training in the field between Dokar and the Satyrs' village. He knew they would be able to see this and would take it more seriously. The answer to that was shortly after the Satyrs began public training of their own warriors. I suppose it should have been obvious then. While heading out of Dokar one day, I was grabbed by some guards and dragged into an alleyway. They beat me quite thoroughly. between the pain. They said the leader had orders for me. I was to figure out why the treasure had not been delivered. If I could not manage to have them send a satyr bearing their answer, then I would not survive my return to Dokar that evening. They then dragged me to the gates and tossed me out of the village. I would have run to the satyrs if I wasn't in such pain. I was able to find my friends. I explained what had happened. They stopped their efforts to clean me of the blood and bruises. They took me to the chief's throne directly. But all we found in the throne room was the warrior's commander. My friends requested an audience with the chief. The commander said the chief was busy, cataloguing the treasures below and would not be disturbed. He made a point to say excluding the human treasures. Those are worthless to the satyrs. The commander was the one in charge for now. Through pain, I explained what had happened, showing my cuts, blood, and bruises from their strikes, and what Dokar wanted. He stood in quiet, allowing me to finish explaining everything. He kept silent for a few moments afterwards. He said he would not risk sending one of his own over to Dokar anymore. They have made it abundantly clear that they are trying to escalate these issues. But they do have a message for me to deliver. He wanted Dokar to know they aren't getting anything anymore. If they must look for a present excuse as to why, they need only look to their military aggression. If they want something more deep, then they need to look into their past. The message made it clear. No treasures would be delivered. After a moment of shock from all of us, my friends protested on my behalf, calling attention to my blood and bruises, what the humans had done to me. They pointed out that if I was to deliver this message, the humans would kill me just for its contents. All he said was, "And?" Everyone went silent at that simple word. They did not care, just like... After everyone stayed silent and had no way to retort, the commander then began his accusations. He pointed out that up to now I have been a human, allowed to move freely between their village and Dokar. He accused me of being a spy and delivering information to Dokar's leader. I am free to deliver this message and die, and that will stop the flow of information. Or I could stay here as long as I like, and the information flow will stop that way. Whichever I choose. He then told the guards to escort me out. Outside in the village again, looking around, it truly hit me. For almost a decade, I had wanted so desperately to stay in the Satyr village, among those who cared for me more than my own species. Now I had my wish. As an outcast. I couldn't understand. I did not deliver any information they did not tell me to. But I didn't get the chance to focus on that thread for long. A satyr ran by, fleeing a pack of warriors, shouting for others to follow his lead, that the hatred between our species had been revived, and they should leave before they are sacrificed on this altar. He made it through the gates, cutting out of the village before being shot down by an arrow. Everyone was shocked. Warriors went out and pulled his body back into the village. He was definitely dead. after they brought the body in. The gates to the Satyr's village were being closed, something that doesn't happen. The commander, who had just accused me, came out of the throne room to make an announcement that too many have attempted to flee. A lockdown was being put into effect immediately. No one allowed in or out of the village. Looking down at the crowd, he then pointed at me, saying, except for me, if I wish to leave, now, then I would be granted. If I left and went back to Dokar, they'd kill me. If I stayed here, I was a prisoner. There wasn't much in the way of choices. I walked away from the gates. I was now stuck in the village, permanently. I was able to stay with my friends at that time. We tried to make our own fun, keep spirits high, but it was difficult. A few weeks into this, my friends began to hint that something good was coming. I had no idea what they were talking about. How could anything good come during all of this? It was only when Kolo did not come back from a trip out that I learned what they really meant. We went out looking for him, and we found him, severely injured and being dragged away by a warrior unit. We were able to stop them and demand to know what was happening. The unit captain stepped forward and proclaimed in a rehearsed tone that Kolo had been caught stealing materials from the stock. Materials that, when compared with other materials reported missing, make a clear picture that he was looking to escape. As punishment for his actions, he is to be conscripted into the warrior unit, and, being that the amount of material stolen was so large, he could not have possibly acted on his own. My friends were trying to gather supplies for us to escape together. Kin and Harren were to be conscripted as well, under suspicion of theft from the stock. They moved to take my friends away, and something snapped in me. My friends fought back, and so did I for once. Even with my weak build, I was able to pull one of the warriors off of my friend. We were met then with the edge of their blades. The others stopped fighting, and so did I. The unit captain, despite never being involved in the scuffle, dusted himself off and told me that I was here on an exception from the commander. That my outbursts will be ignored only this time as an act of human passion. But the others' crimes will not be ignored, and they will still be conscripted. My body tensed, ready to fight again. I looked at my friends. But all of them shook their heads at me. Kin told me to go home. That they'll figure this out. His shaky voice did not give me much in the way of confidence. I watched as the warrior unit at sword point marched my friends away and out of sight. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep, running the events over and over in my head, trying to think of any way I could have gotten us all out of there. But also because the home offered no amount of comfort, haunted by ghosts and shadows of the occupants. One morning, I came out to the eating area, and in a flash of sunlight, I swore I saw my friends all sitting there again, happy and ready to feast. When the sun was out of my eyes, they were gone. My friends were not sitting there. And they may never again. I watched as the tensions between Dokar and the Satyrs did not settle down but only grew. For safety and security reasons, Satyr warrior training was moved from the field between villages into the interior. Drills and combat exercises run in the streets and square. I caught glimpses of my friends among them, often looking like they had taken a beating. But I was never able to get close enough to be able to speak with any of them. I have no idea what would have happened to them if I did. Then, an announcement was made that a battle was scheduled to take place. Most of the guards and warriors would be meeting the day prior to discuss how the battle would go. I saw an opportunity. During that meeting, guards on patrol and watching the walls would be at a minimum. But escape to where? I couldn't go back to Dokar. Fleeing anywhere else would be the best option, but I had nothing left. No way to pay or barter, even just for food. But the human treasures had been disregarded. The chief had deemed them unimportant. My plan to escape the village during their meeting switched to sneaking into the chief's throne. It took some doing, but with most of the guards at that meeting, I was able to get into the throne room, then below to where the treasure was stored. During my infiltration, I needed to hide a few times from guards making their rounds. I overheard some of them talking about the chief's state. He had been in the treasure chamber for weeks. He wouldn't sleep, he barely ate. They believe he had been overcome with dragon sickness. When I made it to the treasure room, I found the chief there, standing among the gold, mesmerized by it all. He truly was lost to the gold and treasures. It wasn't hard to sneak past him and find the corner where the human treasures have been stuffed out of the way, almost discarded. In front of it all was a very old book. One that I recognized. It was in the cave. I did not recognize it as some human treasure. Checking on the chief, nothing had changed. I took a moment to read the book. The page it was open to, it detailed the aftermath of a cave-in, the one that had trapped the Satyr guards down there, the author of this journal, and one of the skeletons we saw when we entered. They said it was the humans who had set off the cave-in. The Burr-lohns attacked this hole-in-the-ground entrance where these satyrs were stationed, pushing them back down into the cave, then retreating. As the satyrs moved to give chase, the cave-in was set off. They believed the attack was because the Burr-lohns' jewels had been stored down there as collateral, while the satyrs worked on a weapon they wanted. According to the entries, it was a few days later, and the author mentions hearing loud noises and construction above. They hoped it was other satyrs trying to loose the rocks trapping them. There were a few more entries as he loses energy and hope. The The noises he heard weren't other satyrs come for them. It must have been the Burr-lohns, setting up their man-made Ever-Death tree. The tree must have been set up as a way to guard the Burr-lohns' valued treasures. But what the long-term goal was, I couldn't really fathom. But now, I had the treasures locked away in that vault, sitting in front of me, a pile on the ground. I took a moment to sift through them, and I found the treasure they had loaned the satyrs all those centuries ago. It was small, something I could fit in my pocket, which was perfect. I began my quiet trip back out of the treasure room, and I came across the chief again. He should have seen me, heard me, been aware of my presence, but he didn't notice it at all. He was definitely lost to this treasure. By the time I was able to get out of the throne room, I was too late to get out of the village. The guards had returned to the walls, the battle plans had been all given. But I had a backup. Satyrs value their sleep before a battle. Everyone who wasn't necessary was going to be sleeping that evening. All I had to do was wait, and the guards on the walls would be at a minimum again. That evening, everything went as I expected. I kept an eye on the guards, on the walls, their rounds. I couldn't believe it. The guard I was going to have to get by was my friend, Harren. I wanted to go to him immediately, tell him what I was doing, try to get him out as well. But I didn't know if the warriors had hurt him enough to fear ever crossing them. All I had to do was get out of the village. With that treasure, I could put a stop to this all and get my friends out safely. I watched him as he made his round, then climbed to the platform running along the wall. Once up there, I began to uncoil some ropes. I caught a glimpse of the field between us and Dokar. The quiet night, the wind moving at a gentle pace, the moon climbing the sky, and the stars fully out. It all seemed so beautiful, so distant from everything that was happening here. Like I was sinking into a peaceful world. And my attention was pulled back into reality. Harren had completed his round and was now looking at me, asking what I was doing up there with it being so cold. I stumbled over my words as I told him I was just trying to get a view of things before, well, what was supposed to happen tomorrow. He looked out and nodded a bit as well, staying silent. Seemingly satisfied with my answer, he walked past me to begin his round again. Once he was out of earshot, I began uncoiling the ropes up there. I wrapped it around a post and created an anchor. Before I could toss it over the wall and begin to climb down, I heard Harren coming back from where he had just left. He started asking me something, but he never got it out. He rounded the corner and saw what I was doing. Shock was the only thing on my face at that moment. He looked between me, the rope in my hand, and the anchor I had made. He finally let out a gentle question. "You're leaving?" There was no anger or malice behind it. It did not have the volume to alert anyone else. I stumbled even worse with my words. I couldn't cobble together an excuse. I told him I was leaving. I offered him to come with me. He just looked back to the anchor I had made and began to stride towards it with purpose. I was certain he was going to cut it down. Instead, he grabbed it and pulled it tighter with his superior strength. He said, "There. That should hold your weight better. I'll pull the rope up when you're off of it." Harren then turned to keep lookout and block anyone from seeing. I hesitated. But I had to try. He didn't give an answer. I offered him to come with me once more. He just peered over his shoulder, a gentle, caring smile on his face. He said, "No. That is not my path, that is yours. Mine is serving my people." I had to accept that. Not because I agreed with it, but because I knew he was being genuine. There would be no convincing him otherwise. He would follow his path to the bitter end. And he already knew the end coming for him. I got out of the village and headed back to Dokar with a plan in mind. The guards there were surprised to see me. They weren't angry, more shocked that I had made it back alive. By now, months after I'd been thrown out of Dokar, they were certain that I was dead. I used that time frame to tell them that I had learned so much of the Satyr's intentions. I demanded to speak with the leader directly, and they escorted me to his chamber. When in the throne room, I began to speak, but the leader barreled over me, asking what the setup was like inside the Satyr's village. How many soldiers did they have? Their weapons and armor. Where was the treasure hoard being stored? I had come up with a plan to offer the Dokar treasure I had taken as a bargaining chip to get him to call off this battle. But his questions, his attitude, they all made it clear that nothing was going to stop him. If I had offered the treasure, he would have just taken it for himself and fought them anyway. I kept it secret. And once I answered his questions to a satisfactory degree, he told me to leave so he could prepare for the battle tomorrow. I wandered. I never truly felt like I belonged in this village, on these streets. But now, that had taken on a new level of disconnection. I made it back home. Oh, my father! The look on his face. He was amazed to see me alive. He was certain that I was dead or perhaps fled. "Why didn't I flee?" he asked. The only one who knew the full extent of the Satyr's treasure hoard, beside myself, was my father. Now the leader knew. I could no longer trust my father in this time where I needed someone to lean on. I stammered out an excuse that to this day I am unsure if he bought. But he seemed satisfied with my answer, then urged me to leave immediately. He didn't want me caught up in this war. He pushed me out the door. And I left Dokar. No one tried to stop me. Even now I was disregarded. With nowhere to go, I sat in the field between villages. Maybe because of the late night sleep deprivation. But I had one more idea I had to try. I slept out in the wilderness. When morning arrived, I was awoken by the battle horns being played. I watched from the side as the gates for both villages opened and their armies marched out onto the field. I could see Dokar's leader and counselors ride out to the center. The Satyr's warrior commander and guards did the same. As they were conversing, both groups at a safe distance from each other, I came running in between them. I spoke to the Satyr commander, taking it out and offering Dokar's treasure to him. He could have it if he would trade it back to Dokar and end this war before it started. He considered it. He then asked me where I got the treasure from. I admitted that I took it as my share for finding the hoard. He said he has no interest in human trinkets. The commander then left the negotiations area, yelling for his warriors to prepare themselves for combat. I slowly turned back to Dokar's leader. There was no way, but I had to. He looked down at me and said he will have all of his treasure before turning his horse away and riding back towards his soldiers. My father, I called out to Dokar's leader, if not to stop this battle, then I would trade the treasure if he would let my father leave with me. The leader didn't even stop to consider. But my father spoke. He told me he would not leave his leader's side. I tried reasoning with him, but he interrupted, shouting, "I will not leave my leader's side!" He told me to go, leave the battlefield, live my life. My father then turned his horse to follow his leader. I had plenty of time to leave the battlefield as they prepared their attacks on each other. I didn't stay to watch, I just left. There was nothing for me here anymore. It was only from stories and legends later that I learned that the battle killed everyone on both sides. Things were evenly matched. Both sides taking out a soldier for a soldier, looking like another's. When the armies were down to their final ranks, the Satyrs used large explosives to try to turn the tide. For a few moments they may have. But then the ground beneath the battlefield gave way. All who had survived up to that point were pulled underground and buried. Stories say all that remains there are two run-down, unoccupied villages and a large, sunken space between them. The traders' treasures in the Satyr's possession have all been taken by bandits and looters and flitted away, lost to random corners of the world again. The only thing that remains in that chamber is the skeleton of the Satyr chief. I never went back. My friends, my family, All of them were lost in this pointless show of power. I tried my damnedest to pull them back from that brink. But they were hell-bent on killing each other. I could go back. There's nothing there now, nothing that could hurt me, at least not directly. But I don't know that I ever will. I never saw the battle, never heard it. All I ever got was stories long after the fact. I don't doubt that they are true. But to me they are just that. Stories. By going there, I won't be able to avoid it any longer. It will be real. Real that those I loved killed themselves for what amounts to little more than a cult. But maybe it is time. Judging by the sun's position, it is past time for this class to be over.